Greetings, Starfighters. Before I get into my preconceptions bit for Sword of Sherwood Forest, I just wanted to address something that came up in the last episode. In case you didn't notice it, my mom added a note in text form, added a note to the video addressing the whole thing about why they had it be Robin Hood's son instead of Robin Hood himself. And I did include a link to the timestamp for it in the pinned comment on that episode. I'm going to go ahead and address it here too, in case you missed all that. She pointed out that if the story wanted to include the signing of the Magna Carta, that happened in history about 20 years after the point where most Robin Hood stories end. So the filmmaker's options would have been to have either a much older Robin or have it be Robin Hood's son. Now, that said, it does improve my opinion of the movie somewhat, though I do still think that if they were going to have it be Robin Hood's son, then why not just have, Maid Marian have been his mom and then give his love interest in the movie a different name? I know it's a little thing, about the movie, but it does kind of bug me. But actually, these movies, by and large, except literally only one of the movies so far in this set has had the Maid Marian from the original mythos, and I don't know why that is. Hopefully, this last movie of the set will cover that. We are looking at Sword of Sherwood Forest, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode. This is a Hammer film. We have not had a Hammer film on this show since season 3, when we had the Satanic Rites of Dracula, where Christopher Lee completely phoned it in, and the plot really felt like it didn't even actually need to have Dracula to be there, which led to my theory that it had started out life as just a simple satanic cult script, and then they shoehorned, Van Helsing and Dracula into it so they could have Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing again. Kind of a letdown to have that be the first Lee Cushing movie that I got to see in full. But yeah, hopefully this will be better. Christopher Lee's not in it, but it'll probably still be okay. I mean, Peter Cushing did plenty of good movies without Christopher Lee. The original Star Wars comes to mind. He was also in Top Secret. So, yes, Sword of Sherwood Forest. We're actually getting a proper... we kind of had a Sheriff of Nottingham in Prince of Thieves. Didn't really do that much compared to some of the other villains, but here it looks like he's going to be the big bad. So, as it really should be. So yeah, let's jump into 1960s Sword of Sherwood Forest. I have now watched Sword of Sherwood Forest from 1960. Before we get into that, however, I just want to note that the video portion of this episode was recorded before the SAG-AFTRA strike started, and, I think some additional clarification from the union is in order. Far as I'm aware, I'm not crossing a picket line to do this. 1, this is a much, much older film, not one currently or about to be released in theaters. 2, it's a British production as is, it was only distributed by Columbia Pictures in the US. And 3, as of this writing, no consumer boycotts have been called for. Oh, and 4, I'm not being paid by any studio to do this. Or by anyone else, really, apart from my one Patreon patron. Anyway, solidarity with the striking actors. And if I failed to mention the writer's strike last episode, I regret the error, but I stand with them as well. And I hope Universal has to pay out the nose for what they did to those trees. Anyway, plot summary, courtesy of Letterboxd. Robin of Locksley and his men stumble on a plot to overthrow Hubert Walter, King's Chancellor and Archbishop of Canterbury. The plotters, the Sheriff of Nottingham and the Earl of Newark, have set an ambush for Walter and Lady Marian Fitzwater. Will Robin get to them before it is too late? So, not only do we have a Hammer film with Peter Cushing in it, Desmond Llewellyn, the original Q from the Bond films, is in this, albeit as a character who doesn't even get a name and isn't in the main credits. And it's directed by Terence Fisher, the director of multiple iconic horror films for the same studio, including the first Dracula film to star Christopher Lee. But he did not direct the subpar Dracula film starring Christopher Lee from season 3 of this show, thankfully. This is all really getting my hopes up for this movie. Let's hope that doesn't backfire. We open on a song being sung about Robin Hood while we see some amazing outdoor shots before shifting quickly to some men working for the sheriff, accosting a man who manages to escape them on horseback despite getting a crossbow bolt in the back, when most of his pursuers are driven back by arrows that seem to come out of nowhere but hit with enough precision to knock the crossbows out of their hands. I'll give you 3 guesses who did that, and the first 2 don't count. The wounded man falls off his horse nearby a lake where a woman was swimming. 2 men, one of whom is Little John, comes across the man and he and the other start to go through his pockets when Robin Hood arrives and tells them he didn't save the man from the sheriff's goons just so they could go through his stuff. They apologize, and after realizing the man isn't dead as they'd originally thought, set to trying to tend to his wounds. They spot the woman who is swimming, and it's not hard to guess who she is. She mistakenly thinks Robin and his men had shot the wounded horse rider, but when he shows her that he was hit with a crossbow bolt and his people are using longbows, she decides to simply take her leave. When Robin tried to approach her again, she pulled out a knife and rather calmly told him to back off. I like her. They banter a bit and she rides off as we move to nighttime at the Merry Men's camp. The usual roster is already all together for this one, mostly, so we either were spared or missed out on the Merry Men's first meetings, depending on your perspectives and preferences. Oh, and when I say mostly, I mean even though Friar Tuck does get referenced as an ally, we don't actually see him ourselves until much later in the movie. As Robin hopes/waits for the wounded horseman to wake up, he and one of the others discuss the mystery of who this man is and why the sheriff's men were chasing him. We fade into the next day and we see Marion ride into the forest to attach a note to a tree with a knife before riding off again. Little John finds it and brings it to Robin. The note tells him to meet her at an inn. He decides to go despite Little John's concerns, all after some 1960s casual sexism. I wanted to use a clip of Linkara actually singing that, but I couldn't find one. He arrives and learns that Marion has arranged a meeting between him and the Sheriff of Nottingham. Yes, this is where Peter Cushing finally enters the picture. I have to say, I am not used to seeing him this young. He's got kind of a 70s George Harrison thing going on here. Though I just realized this was only 17 years before Star Wars. Compared to how he looked in that... Yeah, don't take up smoking, kids. Anyway, he came unarmed, surprisingly, and tries to strike a bargain with Robin in exchange for the wounded horseman from earlier. Initially, he offers money, and eventually even a full pardon, but Robin rejects the offer, much to Marion's shock. Both men leave the inn, and Robin rides off. Some of the sheriff's men do show up with their own horses to try and give chase, but are quickly driven back by arrows from the merry men. When Robin returns to the camp, the wounded horseman from earlier awakens briefly while he and Little John are talking, and manages to say a little before passing out again. Something about needing to get to somewhere or someplace called, Bortray? I think. I have no idea. There was no closed caption on this set, so I'm not entirely sure what he was saying. If he was, I could have just Googled it. At the very least, known how to spell it in the script as it is. I have it in here that's not onomatopoeically. I have it in here phonetically. That is such an odd mistake for me to make. Anyway, Robin finally sees an item the horseman had been carrying on him and that the sheriff's men had tried to take from him in the opening of the movie. Of course, if you remember the plot summary I read just a few minutes ago, you already know what this is about, but roll with me here. We fade to the next day, and hordes of the sheriff's men are searching the woods. And the sheriff is with them, giving careful and, dare I say, practical instructions. I like a competent villain. Makes it all the more satisfying when the hero beats them. Not that you can't have an antagonist who's kind of dumb, but that really only works in broad comedies and satires. The merry men decide to break camp and head elsewhere rather than try to fight directly, and we see the camp being dismantled in a rapid but not chaotic fashion. We didn't necessarily need to see this process, but it doesn't drag, and it properly conveys the urgency of the moment. A fade cut would have been fine here, but you might have lost some tension as a result. They even managed to sneak a tiny bit of comedy here, with some of the merry men trying to gather up their farm animals for the move. It doesn't feel shoehorned in, nor does it overstay its welcome. Unfortunately, one of the merry men's lookouts, a younger man named Martin, is captured and brought to the sheriff. The sheriff recognizes Martin, asks him how long it's been since he's seen his wife and children, and twice offers a pardon in exchange for the location of the camp, not even raising his voice the entire time before having him held up against a tree to be shot. Martin caves and gives a location of the camp, but the sheriff has him executed by crossbow anyway. The pardon is still given, just posthumously. The quiet menace Peter Cushing gives this character is not a surprise to anyone who's seen the original Star Wars, but it's just as effective here as it was there. I'd say that he's doing in this movie what George McCready in the previous movie was trying to do, but fell short. The sheriff's men arrive at the camp, but everything of value has already either been taken away or left broken. And there's also a fresh grave, who the sheriff's men assumes belongs to the man they've been after the whole time, but the sheriff himself casually says that graves have been known to be empty and orders it dug up. We cut to Marion riding her horse and coming across Martin, who is not yet fully dead. Robin and another of the merry men come across Marion tending to the dying man, who delusionally mistakes her for his wife, but is able to apologize to Robin for betraying him before dying. We fade back to the abandoned camp, and it turns out that in fact the horseman from earlier was in the grave. But when the sheriff tells one of his men to check his purse for the item mentioned earlier, he finds nothing. Robin and Marion have their first kiss of the movie, but it's nothing special, so let's move on. 31 minutes in, we suddenly get a new character, who, before we get his name, we get to see ordering some of the soldiers' men to stop whipping and free a man tied to a post by the sheriff's orders. This is the Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, from the summary. We cut to Marion and the sheriff having an argument where, of course, the sheriff justifies his murder of Martin by pointing out that he was an outlaw, because even in the 13th century, ACAB applies. Robin meets with Friar Tuck to ask about the emblem and the place where the horseman was headed to, and Tuck doesn't say much beyond it being a long trip. Then, almost halfway through the movie, the other conspirator mentioned in the summary, the Earl of Newark, shows up. It's okay if you forgot about him, I did too. Also, he kind of reminds me of Pat DiNizio, the lead singer of the Smithereens, who died in 2017, or at least how he looked during the heyday of the Smithereens. Great band, by the way. If you've never heard the Smithereens, you should check out the Smithereens. Where was I? Oh, right. We also meet the Earl's right-hand man, and he is a massive tool. Less than 1 minute with his dick, and I'm already looking forward to his death more than the sheriff's. Or the Earl's, for that matter. And that's before we even get a name for him. Anyway, we learn his name is Melton when the Earl demands he and Robin, not that he knows it's Robin Hood at this point, up to an archery test. It makes sense in context. He does so by making Robin kill Melton's falcon. Okay, I take it back now, I do want the Earl to die first. That was fucked up. While the Earl demonstrates his own bow skills, Robin notices an emblem slide partially out of the Earl's pocket, and it's the same as the one the dead horseman was carrying. So Robin plays along and lets the Earl hire him on, while subtly letting Tuck know to let the merry men know where he'll be going. This leads into the one big misfire of the movie, the segment where Tuck tries repeatedly to get his donkey to cooperate for the ride to Bortrain or Bortree, and man, I wish I had closed captioning for this, but anyway, the scene, it's trying to be funny, but I am not laughing. Hubert Walter re-enters the movie at this point for some political stuff involving real estate that's not actually boring to watch, but boring as fuck to write about, so I'm not even going to try. You'll need to see this for yourself to appreciate. Every actor in this scene understood the assignment, especially Cushing and Jack Gwillim, the actor who plays Hubert. We cut back to the Earl and Robin, and the Earl is giving Robin more archery tests, clearly as practice for the planned assassination. After an aside with Tuck and Marion, we see the sheriff arriving to meet the Earl, and thankfully hijinks are avoided as he spots Robin Hood fairly quickly, and the two immediately begin a sword fight, which the Earl just leans against a wall to watch. The sword fight's okay, but I think we can chalk that up to when it was made. A more modern version of this, it would probably look cooler. This is also the first real sword fight of the movie, at roughly 55 minutes in. You know, in a lesser movie, that would be a knock against it, but here that actually kind of works. When the sheriff gets knocked down during the fight, he finally calls upon his guards, and Robin is forced to flee. The sheriff yells, for the first time in the movie, come to think of it, to order a pursuit, but the Earl calls it off. Far from being upset that a notorious outlaw had been in his presence the whole time, he finds the whole thing rather amusing, and then tells the sheriff that outlaws have their uses. We fade to Marion riding alongside and conversing with Hubert Walter about the sheriff, and from there to Robin, Tuck, and Little John at their new camp, and long story short, Robin is able to piece together that the Earl and the sheriff are plotting what you and I already knew they were plotting from the summary that I copied off of Letterboxd. Robin learns that Marion is with Hubert and rides off with Little John and two others to stop the assassination and save both. A number of men loyal to the sheriff, dressed as merry men, ambush Hubert and his entourage, and while most are taken out quickly, his chief bodyguard, Marion, and the Archbishop himself, as it turns out, are able to hold their own against the assassins despite being outnumbered. Long enough for Robin Hood himself to come to the rescue, though the chief bodyguard does still fall in the battle. Hubert and Marion make it to a priory, which the sheriff learns from one of the assassins before he dies. Robin manages to get there and tries to warn the Archbishop, but what a twist, the prioress is in on the plot, taking out her own emblem when no one is looking. The sheriff's men proceed to burn down a small village. This relates to that real estate stuff I skimmed over earlier. And then something unexpected happens. The sheriff is killed by one of the Earl's men, stabbed in the back after the two were arguing about how to try and kill Hubert next. The Earl decides to just take the direct approach and bring some men with him to the priory, and it turns out the prioress is his cousin. The final battle takes place during morning prayers, and Robin is able to kill the douchebag with the falcon and the Earl, along with one other soldier, whilst the Archbishop takes down a few himself. Little John is badly wounded during the fight, and spends the rest of the movie with his arm in a sling. The Archbishop spends the night at the Merry Men's camp. Little John laughs at Friar Tuck's attempts to get the Archbishop to ease up on new fasting rules, and Robin and Marion walk off into the forest together while a short song plays. The end. Was that the end a little too curt for me? I mean, I actually do like this movie. I'm just worried that it's not entirely being conveyed with my voice. Random thoughts I had while watching the movie. The score for this movie feels kind of generic to me. Like, I've heard it before, and not just in movies on this set. 2. I could be wrong, but I think the actor they got for Alan Adale in this movie was playing his instrument for real. Nice touch. 3. Most of the outdoor scenes in this movie look better than all the previous ones. And some of those were pretty good looking, so that's saying a lot. For Bandit of Sherwood Forest, the outdoor footage is about the only good thing about it. 4. The douchebag with the falcon was played by an uncredited Oliver Reed. So there's another actor who was at the start of an illustrious career in this. 5. The movie had only about 19 minutes left to it before I realized I don't think we ever got a Will Scarlet in this movie. And also that Alan Adale has been absent since Act 1 for no apparent reason. Must have been a budget thing. 6. The Robin Marion romance of this movie was pretty weak, honestly. It wasn't terrible, the movie just dedicated almost no time to it, not allowing it any room to feel organic. Final verdict. This is a pretty slow-paced movie, but that's about normal for this director's filmography, so that's not really a knock against it. I was okay with the pacing, actually, but I freely admit a lot of other people might not be, so just be aware of that before you decide whether or not to watch it. It's also less action-driven than most Robin Hood movies, which, again, I have no problem with, but if you prefer your Robin Hood media to feature some buckling of slosh, that's completely valid. But for me, there are so many movies about Robin Hood, I appreciate a unique take, and going for more of a mystery vibe for this one certainly qualifies. Admittedly, in addition to not having as much time spent on it as I think it deserved, the mystery isn't that complex. Jessica Fletcher or Columbo could have solved this shit in 5 minutes. But still, the idea is appreciated. That said, it's not as much a lock for the top spot in the season wrap-up as I thought it might be. It may well still be, but it's going to be a close one. Number 1 and number 2, I'm going to have to sit on that one for a while. I think this might be the tightest matchup for the top spot since... yeah, I'm going to say between Ghost Shark and Mississippi River Sharks back in Season 6. I'm definitely going to need to give this more thought before making a final decision. Speaking of the season wrap-up, that's what's coming up next on Shameless Cashgrab. Tune in for when I rank these 5 movies against each other and announce the set chosen for Season 10. Yeah, Season 10. Have fun, stay safe, disregard the constabulary.